Hello everybody. We are about to start. Hi, my name is Jae-yoon and I'm PhD student in LLE program. And I'm here to introduce Dr.Icy. She is a professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction of the Faculty of Education at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Her main research interests are in second language writing and second language teacher education. And today she's giving us talk on feedback on writing issues, challenge, and future directions. And lecture gonna be about 1 hour, including Q&A. And also I'd like to inform that this lecture gonna be video recorded. So please join me welcome Dr. Icy.
Thank you, Jae-yoon, for introducing me and for organizing this public lecture. Okay, the topic I've chosen to talk about is feedback in L2 writing. It's a topic which is very, very close to my heart. I started researching this topic more than 10 years ago. I became very interested, and I'll tell you why in a second. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on some of the major issues, challenges, and future directions. Okay, I'm from Hong Kong, right? So I'm very familiar with the situation in Hong Kong. Let's look at what some frontline teachers in Hong Kong think about this topic. Okay, it's from a secondary teacher of English in Hong Kong. And she said, "We mark for the sake of marking or satisfying the requirements of the school. The situation is problematic. For one thing, it seems that students do not benefit from our feedback. On the other hand, they also remain essentially passive." Okay? So I think this teacher has quite succinctly highlighted some major issues as far as feedback is concerned. Another secondary teacher of English in Hong Kong, she said, "As a teacher, marking students' writing has been the most tiring and tedious job to me. Like many language teachers, I'm easily fed up with the never-ending corrections I have to do for my students, and what makes it even worse is that the way we mark the papers doesn't work wonders at all on improving their editing skills, as students continue to make mistakes, even the very same mistakes." So, do these folks ring a bell, especially for those who are teachers right now or who have teaching experience? So in this presentation, I'm going to first share with you my prior experience as a writing teacher, and then very briefly my experience as a writing researcher, and finally I'll end this presentation with some suggestions for future directions. Okay. As a writing teacher before, I don't teach writing as such. I don't teach surface English, I don't teach academic writing because I'm based in the Faculty of Education. But before, I taught writing. So what's my experience like? When I recall my writing experience, my teaching experience, I focused a lot on grammatical accuracy. Okay? For your information, I taught 5 years in a secondary school in Hong Kong before, and I taught surface English in Hong Kong University. I also taught ESL in Vancouver before. So those were the times when I had to mark student writing. And I marked every single written error. I often provided corrections for students, especially when I was a secondary school teacher. And I used codes like abbreviations, P for preposition, T for tense, and so on. I used error codes without thinking much about whether they were useful or they were effective. I treated writing as a product mainly. I collected single drafts. And I marked every single piece. So you can imagine I worked very hard as a teacher. I made students play a very passive role because I worked too hard, way too hard, right? And I failed to see that writing assessment was kind of disconnected from teaching and learning. Every time I marked, it was like marking every single error and then giving a score on content, very general, and giving a score on organization without being aware of the text type or genre. Okay. But, okay, emotionally, I must admit, I hated marking student writing. I must admit it, right? But never did it occur to me that I could mark writing in another way. I never thought I could. I never even harbored this thought. Because like I was born and raised in a very conventional setting in Hong Kong, right? Although it was British colony before, I felt that on the whole, the way teachers taught in local classrooms was still primarily affected by very traditional Chinese cultural values. Okay. Because all teachers marked in this way, I thought it was the so-called tried and trusted method, right? And I never thought of alternatives. And I also thought I was paid to mark writing. Although I hated it, it was like, I felt guilty when I started to feel that I hated it because I thought I should do it, okay? But I knew very well that, okay, students do not improve much despite my meticulous feedback. And as a teacher, including my colleagues, when I was a teacher, I was really exhausted. Okay? And I know that some teachers suffer from burnout as a result of the meticulous feedback they have to give to the student writing. For students, they become afraid, they drag writing, they lose confidence because they receive papers filled with the red ink. So psychologically, they feel that they're not happy about the scores, and I would call it a lose-lose situation. It's a no-win situation for teacher and students. Okay. However, I think the problem is that at a higher level, the school administrators, leaders, even parents, they think this is the best way to go about marking. I like it. I like to see hard-working teachers. Okay. So same for parents, they want detailed feedback from teachers to prove that they are hardworking, right? And students, poor students, you know, especially in a traditional Chinese context, their mindsets are shaped, their beliefs are shaped by the way teachers teach and the way teachers deliver feedback. Okay, they're not able to think outside the box. So, a question which has plagued me is, how can teachers respond to writing in a more effective manner? Let's look very briefly at some of the very general best feedback practices put forward by feedback researchers. Like Jenna Ferris is one of the most distinguished researchers in feedback, in the area of feedback research. Okay, I must tell you that these sound very commonsensical actually. Like, teacher feedback should have balanced coverage, not focusing mainly on grammar, but there should be a balanced coverage on content, organization, language, mechanics, style, or even genre. Okay? And teachers should vary their feedback according to individual student needs. We've got to be student-centered. And we should not be thinking about the teachers only. What about the peers? What about the students themselves? Self-evaluation is also important, so there should be multiple sources of feedback. And what about written as opposed to oral feedback? So the mode of feedback is important. So teachers can always deliver feedback orally, face-to-face, in individual conferences or in group conferences. As far as written commentary is concerned, research has found that vague, non-text specific written commentary is not as useful as very concrete, very specific and text specific. Like if you say, interesting content, this comment can be stuck to any piece of writing, right? So students do not know how interesting the content is. So if your content, if your feedback is very specific, is interesting because you are able to use this and that, blah, 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 then the student knows what she or he did well, okay? And some teachers even put words into students' mouths, trying to guess what the student writer is trying to say. This is a very important finding because effective feedback is given not to single drafts or terminal drafts, but to intermediate drafts. So the implication being it's important to require multiple drafting because if you ask students to produce only terminal drafts, and however detailed your feedback is, students don't have to act on your feedback. So students don't really have to act on it, engage with it, they just read it. They read and put it aside and forget, right? But if they have to act on it, they read, they think, they engage with it, and they use it to improve their writing. There's a huge difference here. For error feedback specifically, according to Ferris, a more selective approach is going to work better than a more comprehensive approach. The difference is a comprehensive approach meaning teachers respond to every single written error. Okay? A selective approach means teachers respond to a selected number of errors or error types. Okay? There are two types of error feedback. One is more direct, one is more indirect. What does it mean? First of all, researchers found that indirect error feedback in general is more helpful than direct feedback for long-term writing development. As the word suggests, direct error feedback is you are very direct. You point out the error and you provide the correct answer. Okay? For example, it should not be go but went, so you write the word went next to the error. For indirect error feedback, you may just underline, circle. You may use a code, you may not use a code, but whether you use a code or not, if you don't give the correct answer, is indirect. Okay? So indirect can be coded, can be uncoded. Right? Uncoded, no code. Coded with a code, but still indirect. Okay? I know it's confusing, so I'm trying to explain to you as well. Okay? So the major difference between direct and indirect feedback is whether you give the correct answer. Okay? Again, it's commonsensical because if you give indirect error feedback, students get your indirect feedback and they think, oh, why? What's wrong with this? So they start thinking. For peer feedback, as one source of feedback, researchers found that sometimes, a lot of researchers saying that, oh, students don't appreciate peer feedback, they don't find it useful. And I think there is research based in Taiwan, Min. She's done quite a lot on peer feedback, and she's done something about peer feedback training, and she's found that training is really essential to effective peer feedback. Students need to be trained and coached, and they need to be empowered. They need to learn how to go about giving peer feedback. Okay. And grouping is another important consideration so there are so many variables which affect the effectiveness of peer feedback, including grouping, whether it's friendship grouping, random grouping, size of the group, and so on. Okay. Conferences, we know. Face-to-face, the personal touch is so useful. But I know it's time-consuming. So teacher-student conferences, according to Ferris, can involve pairs, groups, and students should be helped to play an active role during conferencing. So before the conference, it's useful to ask students to read the feedback first, think about the questions, and come to the conference session to ask questions, to negotiate with the teacher, and so on. Okay. So the challenge is that in reality, these best practices recommendations, they seem so commonsensical, right? But research has found that these recommendations have really failed to affect classroom practices. Okay? Which means that the researchers, they are very busy researching, right? Coming up with insights. But the teachers are also busy teaching in the same old way, right? So there is a missing link, really. I would say quite a serious missing link between theory, research, and practice as far as feedback is concerned. So as a teacher educator, I'm really interested in this question. Why? Why is it so? What can explain this missing link, right? The theory or research practice divide. And more importantly, what can be done to improve the situation so that we can really make use of the research insights to improve practice. So as a writing researcher, as I told you, I became very interested in this topic. I remember since late 1990s, I was living in Vancouver at that time. One day, I read up an article. It was like a wake-up call to me, and that article is very important to me, and I think this article is important to every single feedback researcher, unless they should know, right? This article is written by this very quiet guy, very soft-spoken guy called John Truscott, based in Taiwan. He never attends conferences, I heard, right? But his writing is so incisive. And he's published this landmark article in 1996 in Language Learning. I think the title is The Case Against Grammar Correction in Algebra Writing Class or something like that. Okay? So he is totally, absolutely against error correction in writing. I read it, I was so fascinated because I never thought that teachers could even consider the possibility of not marking written errors. All right? So I felt very fascinated, and because of that article, I became very interested in error correction research. So some of the key issues I began to explore. The very first research project back in Hong Kong, 2001 to 2, I applied for a research grant and I looked specifically at error correction. Okay? So what are teachers' perspectives and practices? I want to get some sort of baseline information about what teachers are actually doing as far as error feedback is concerned. Okay? I'm also interested, okay, look, teachers are so busy marking errors. Actually, how well do they fare? Do they do a good job in error correction? Okay. And what are students' perceptions? So on the one hand, what do teachers do? How well do they do it? And what do students think? Right, so I've published these findings already. So I'm just sort of sharing with you some of my research findings. Major findings, very briefly. Okay, not to my surprise, the large majority of Hong Kong teachers, secondary, okay, mark errors comprehensively. Okay, my sample size is still limited, so I can't claim that all teachers are like this. They use a limited range of error feedback strategies, mainly direct, that means giving correct answers, and coded, giving codes. Okay, not surprising in Hong Kong because teachers receive lots of guidelines from their senior colleagues. So one guideline is, please use codes. Okay. Some teachers use direct error feedback to save their trouble. So in my interview, one teacher said, when students don't understand the codes, they come to ask me individually. So a class of 40 students, so they line up. I'd rather correct errors for them because I don't want them to come out and ask for the corrections. Not enough time. Okay, so 40 students in a class. Coded feedback, average number of error types adopted by Hong Kong teachers, schools range from, can you imagine, 15 to 26. And I've seen some real samples, error coding sheets used in real schools by real teachers, handed down from generation to generation. 26, that 26 thing is like all the tenses receive a special code. So it's not like T for tense, but they have present tense, simple present tense, could be P dot, T dot, C dot, present continuous tense, P dot, CON, T dot, T dot. You know, you can imagine seeing lots of different yet similar and confusing codes. So it's confusing not only for teachers but also students. Okay, but this is happening in Hong Kong schools. Students' feedback. So I interview students, I don't have clear concepts of the parts of speech. I know the codes, I know AR is article, I know this is this, but I cannot correct, I'm not clear. For some codes, my teacher hasn't explained to me, so I don't know how to use them. And for a lot of teachers, it's like they have learned the grammatical concepts, but they learn and they forget, right? Very common phenomenon. It's troublesome and time wasting. If the teacher corrects it for me, I think it's easier for me to handle. So some teachers explicitly express the wish to get direct feedback because it's easy for them. Many teachers do not find their own error feedback effective. They admit that it's not very effective, but students expect teachers to give comprehensive error feedback. They don't necessarily understand it. This is a problem. And another important finding is teachers' performance in error correction leaves much to be desired. Why? I administered an error correction task to about 60 teachers and analyzed the accuracy of their error correction, right? And I found that about 57% of the error corrections were accurate. About 43% inaccurate and unnecessary. And about Okay, these are some examples of inaccurate and unnecessary feedback. In that student essay, in the original essay, the student wrote some and other things. Okay, at least one teacher corrected this as some, many other things. So changing and to many, still wrong. So this is classified as inaccurate error correction on the part of the teacher. The 3 problems that are causing damage to the beach. So it's about water pollution. That essay is about water pollution on the beach. Damage. There are 3 teachers in my sample out of the 60 who corrected this as causing damages. Okay, damage is correct, it's uncountable noun, but not damages. Omission, because the teachers claimed that they did correct all written errors. So if there were omissions, it was regarded as inaccurate. Right? Some rubbish on the sea. It went unmarked. Okay? So these are examples. So some remaining questions are, okay, teachers have very, very entrenched practice about error correction. Although students say, I expect detailed feedback from my teacher, they don't necessarily understand and get benefit from it. And teachers do not always or necessarily provide accurate error corrections. And again, it's commonsensical. If the error corrections are not accurate, student learning will suffer as a result. Okay, so after that project, I thought, okay, I should not just focus on error feedback. I should broaden a bit to look at teacher-written feedback practices, because feedback, there's more to feedback than error feedback, right? Teachers could give feedback on content, organization, and other aspects. So in this project, some of the key issues I looked at: how do teachers respond to student writing? Why do they respond in the ways they do? What factors have influenced their feedback practices? I think these questions are really essential to the original question I have asked. Remember that question? Why is there a missing link between research, theory, and practice? So I'm asking these questions. How come they mark in this way for generations? Like, what are the reasons? And how do students react to teacher feedback? Are there any discrepancies between teachers' beliefs and practices regarding feedback? And if so, why? So these seem pretty complicated issues, but I feel that as a teacher educator, I'm really interested in these questions. Okay, so overall, when I collected these compositions from different schools, I looked at the results of the focuses of teacher feedback. Not surprising again, because like about 94% of the teacher feedback focused on the language form. All right? Okay. And then this secondary teacher wrote or said, I still remember every time my teachers marked my writing, they marked all the grammatical mistakes, but seldom or never commented on the content of writing. One of my teachers told me that if I'm grammatically error-free, I would get a high mark in a public examination. Therefore, I believed that the most important point in assessing writing is to make sure that there is no error in the writing. Marking compositions is just like doing proofreading exercises. It is a task to find out all the errors in the writing. So this is that teacher's own prior learning experience. So in my research, I also found that single drafts are collected, no revision required. There is a heavy focus on scores. Teachers use broad assessment criteria instead of very specific or text-specific or genre-specific criteria or rubrics to assess writing. Students play a passive role. Very rarely do they engage in peer evaluation. Okay, what are the factors that influence teachers responding to feedback practices? A few factors have emerged, including the school policy, which required detailed marking, encourages the use of error codes, encourages written comments, provides broad assessment criteria, and sees error-free writing as an important goal of writing. And teacher appraisal, I'm going to look at each factor very briefly. Okay, what does it mean? In the teacher appraisal form, you know, teachers have to be appraised. All right? Professors also have to be appraised, right? I think everyone in the workplace has to be appraised. And in Hong Kong schools, a lot of schools use a sort of appraisal form. And I collected a few appraisal forms. I look at in one form that I have seen, this is one of the items on the appraisal form. So this item asks the principal or the department head of English or the vice principal to check teachers' written feedback. So they collect students' compositions, the marked compositions, like once or twice a year. So they do random checking. And there is one question for the school administrator or department head to respond to. This question is feedback to student writing. Much, average, little or none. So you can see the focus is on the quantity of feedback. Okay? So in Hong Kong schools, the quantity of feedback seems to be important and is part of appraisal. So factor 1, accountability. So teachers, in teachers' words, I hate marking. I do it for the panel chair. Panel chair is the English department chair and principal. I don't think it's really benefiting my students. I have my own thoughts, but I must follow the panel policy. I have once argued with the panel chair that underlining errors without using symbols is good enough, but she was not convinced. My panel chair thinks we cannot do less work or else we will be criticized. So maybe this is part of the Chinese culture or the Confucian heritage culture. If you mark less, it seems that we have more free time. And colleagues teaching other subjects, especially Chinese language, will be jealous. Yes, this is what they said, right? Because they also have to collect compositions. Teachers believe about the primacy of accuracy. Some teachers do believe it's so important to focus on written accuracy. The panel chair often reminds us that we are teachers of English. This is our role, okay? And our mission, our vision, is to help students reduce grammatical mistakes. So we should put more emphasis on grammar and vocabulary. We have to tell students what mistakes they have made in their writing so that they will avoid making the same mistakes. So the mindset is very simple. Tell students what mistakes they have made. The logic is, tell them. They will avoid making the mistakes. To me, it's overly simplistic, really. Okay? For those who are parents, like myself, I always tell my children to do well, to go to bed early, blah, 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 but they never take it. So I think similarly, it's quite similar, I think. You tell your students, they don't do it. It's just normal, I think. Yeah. There is not enough room for us to mention content because, you know, it's overwhelming. There are so many mistakes. They spend so much time marking errors. I don't have the time and energy to really respond to content in some detail. Okay? Factor 3, wow, so familiar to a lot of people here. Like if you come from an exam-oriented culture, we could not afford the time for multiple drafting. We should focus on the accuracy of writing so that in public exams, the markers can understand what students are saying and they can get a pass at least. In public exams, writing with good grammatical accuracy is rated highly irrespective of content. I think some teachers have this way of thinking. Even though the content is really mediocre or below average, if the grammar is okay, then overall it's still okay, right? Factor 4 is lack of teacher training, right, which some of you may agree. I never received any training about how I should mark writing, never, right? And some of my student teachers, same for them. So the diploma in education in Hong Kong had micro teaching practice and lectures on lesson planning, you know, classroom communication, ELT methodology, but not on feedback strategies in writing. I think I actually learned most from my colleagues. There are seniors who teach us what to do when it comes to marking student writing. But the senior colleagues' practices are also the ingrained practices passed from their own senior colleagues. I don't pay much attention to the contents of the syllabus in the curriculum guide, right? But I know the requirements of the public exams. I think the Education Ministry stuff is impractical, okay, rather remote from reality. So in the Ministry of Education curriculum stuff, in Hong Kong is very much in line with what is being recommended in the research literature. Like in our curriculum documents, the suggestion is to mark errors more selectively. But A, teachers don't have time to read the documents, they're not aware. B, even though they read the documents, they're not really sort of mandated. So they still think that it's important to mark every error. Okay, what about student reactions? Actually, do students like what they receive, and do they really learn? Students expect teachers. If you ask them, they expect, yes, I want to get everything, a lot of comments, feedback from my teachers, almost everything. I like it. Oh yeah, I like it. I like that, right? It's the same for Canadian students. Yeah. Yeah, why not, right? Students know, they're happy to know that teachers are working hard. Why not, right? But in my study, students of lower proficiency, in Hong Kong secondary schools, there are 3 types. We call it Band 1, Band 2, Band 3. To me, it's a very cruel system. Band 1, the top academically. So Band 3 are like, the worst. In the past, there were 5 bands, now there are 3 bands. But they are stereotyped as lower banding students. And I conducted a study in Band 3 school. Actually, even in Band 1 school, there are students of lower proficiency. But you can imagine Band 3 schools, the proficiency is really low. They are less positive about teacher feedback. They want less focus on accuracy. Why? Only half of the students, why is again commonsensical. So much feedback is not manageable. I'm so weak in English. And you point out all the errors. I cannot understand fully. I cannot manage, right? And I think one interesting thing is that I think almost all teachers in Hong Kong schools, they ask students to submit handwritten essays, not word-processed essays, right? So handwritten essays. They also deliver feedback in handwriting, for teachers. And only half of the students in my study have found that some of the teacher feedback is illegible. They cannot really read and understand fully. Okay, so student voices. I feel that the student voices are somehow missing in a lot of classroom research, including feedback research. So we have to listen to the student voices. So some interview quotes here. I will forget after reading teachers' feedback, so I will make the same mistake. Normal, right? Sometimes I don't understand what the teacher has corrected, so I will just copy the answers as corrections. I did not know very well what I was good at. This is important. I just received papers filled with the red ink, meaning I'm weak. But what am I good at? Tell me, right? Okay. Is it overwhelming? Can I go on? So another aspect of my study, mismatches. Okay, I think teachers are really strange creatures. On the one hand, teachers have a lot of ideals. They have a lot of beliefs. I think I should do this, A, B, C, D, F, G, right? But I cannot do this. From A to Z, I can do A, or B, or C, right? So they have a lot of constraints, and therefore I feel that teachers are not very happy people in a lot of contexts because they have ideals and yet they're not able to put their ideals into practice. I really have a lot of sympathy for those kinds of teachers. So that's why I'm also very interested in research about teacher cognitions, teacher beliefs, and teacher practices. So from my research, I discovered 10 mismatches between teacher beliefs and practices. Okay. First, very briefly, teachers pay most attention to language form in their feedback, but they believe there is more to good writing than accuracy. Strange, right? Second mismatch. Teachers mark errors comprehensively, although for a lot of teachers, they will tell you, actually, I prefer selective marking. Right? Teachers tend to correct and locate errors for students, underlining, right, for students, but they believe that through teacher feedback, students should learn to correct and locate their own errors. They should become more autonomous. No teachers will disagree with that, learner autonomy, and yet they underline errors. Don't forget that editing starts with locating errors. If we locate errors for teachers, for students all the time, we are depriving students of the opportunity to acquire or develop self-editing skills. Teachers use error codes, although they think students have a limited ability to understand the codes. Teachers award scores and grades to student writing, although they are almost certain that mark and grades draw students' attention away from teacher feedback. Again, this is commonsensical. Teachers respond mainly to weaknesses in student writing, although they know that feedback should cover both strengths and weaknesses. Probably because of the red ink, they don't have time, space, and energy to respond to the overall strengths of student writing. And teachers' written feedback practice allows students a little room to take control, although teachers think students should learn to take greater responsibility for learning. Teachers ask students to do one-shot writing, single drafting, okay? Although they think process writing is beneficial. Okay? I think very few teachers, even in Hong Kong, disagree with the spirit of process writing. Okay? Teachers continue to focus on student-written errors, although they know that mistakes will recur. Teachers continue to mark student writing in the ways they do, although they think that their effort does not pay off. Right? So teachers are really, in a very difficult situation. Lots of remaining questions. So I would say my research has reviewed a lot of complex issues, but there are a lot of remaining questions, like feedback is a situated act. It is influenced by tons of contextual factors. Very complicated. Teachers spend a large amount of time on feedback, but it's not effective and cost-effective. How can change be promoted? Okay. What do you think? How should research be continued? Any suggestion before I go on? If you are a researcher, what would you do?
Have a conversation another time.
Conversation. Lots of things that could be done, but for me, at that point of time, at that juncture, I felt, okay, what about teachers' feedback literacy and feedback innovation in the classroom? I should go encourage teachers, empower them to implement some innovation in the classroom. Okay, so my recent interest, don't forget I'm a teacher educator, so my heart is always in the classroom and in trying to help teachers improve their practices. So some of the key issues: how can teachers enhance their feedback literacy and be helped to bring innovation? Be helped. They need to be helped really to conventional feedback practices. And how is best practice feedback advice interpreted and implemented in specific classroom contexts? Are these research questions interesting to you? I don't know, but they are very interesting to me, right? Okay. Have not published, but upcoming, right? Forthcoming. Okay. I have to start by saying that the word innovation has to be interpreted specifically. Innovation need not be something, wow, groundbreaking, revolutionary, drastically new, as if you were going to receive a Nobel Prize. No. What is innovative in this context may be something really old in another context. So, I adopt this definition: an idea, practice, or object perceived as new by an individual or other units of adoption. As long as it's considered new, it's new, not adopted, then it's innovative. Okay. So it's important to provide teacher education on feedback and writing. And this is, in my context, delivered through teacher education courses. For example, in my university, I teach an MA in the LT program, and there is one course called Reading and Writing, Teaching and Learning. So this course provides input on both reading and writing. And I also go to schools to give school-based professional development seminars, especially upon invitation. Okay, so these are examples of my attempts at reaching out to teachers and delivering teacher education on feedback in writing. Of course, through research papers as well. Not only my own research papers, but research papers by other scholars in the field. So feedback innovation in my research context and in the context of my participating teachers include from unfocused written corrective feedback to focused, from unfocused to focused, focused. I notice I'm using a different set of terminology here. Written corrective feedback is error feedback or error correction. Okay, that means In Hong Kong, teachers are familiar with marking all errors in an unfocused manner. But in my research, I encourage teachers, and teachers also feel the need to experiment with a more focused or a more selective approach to written error correction feedback. Are you with me? All right. So this is one innovation. Sorry about the typo here. Okay. And Hong Kong teachers are more familiar in my research context in the two schools. They are more familiar with giving direct answers. So the teachers said that they would like to experience with selective error feedback plus coded. Because they only select a small number of error categories, they feel that using codes are manageable. Okay? It's not 15 to 26 different codes, but it's a small number of codes given to a selected number of error categories. Okay. Sorry, why is it like that? Page down, okay. Okay. From single drafting to multiple drafting. Teachers in my research context were very much aware that if they were to improve their feedback practices, their feedback has to be delivered in a process-oriented classroom. Okay? So they also try to make use of peer feedback to involve students more actively. So salient findings, I don't have time. So salient findings, how the teachers went about change. Okay. I've got two teacher participants called Gwen and Amelia. They are pseudonyms. Gwen, teaching secondary students. She pre-selected 3 to 4 grammar items for each text type. So what she did was she gave focused error feedback. She used codes. She said the feedback given is focused and not that direct. For example, ART, so that they can think about, oh, did I use the wrong article? Why should I use there instead of A? They can reflect in this way. Students given opportunities to reflect on and self-correct their errors as well. Okay. And focused written corrective feedback was more manageable, according to Gwen, for her students. Her students were a bit weak. In the first 4 months of the study, it was a naturalistic study, okay? Gwen implemented focused, coded WCF, written corrective feedback, quite consistently. Gradually, interestingly, she marked more and more errors and used fewer and fewer codes. Eventually, Gwen reverted to marking all errors and providing correct answers. Okay? So she reverted back to her previous approach. Why? She said she lost her determination to innovate after the first term. Can you guess why? She worried about the different practices of other colleagues in her school, especially those teaching at the same grade level. She was uncertain about students' attitudes because throughout, the students were so much used to the old approaches. Teachers and students in school, they were used to the conventional practice. It's like a policy, and the students will feel more comfortable. As students compare, and colleagues will also compare. Another participating teacher, Amelia, she conducted peer evaluation a few times within the process approach. From my lesson observation, this peer evaluation was interpreted a bit superficially by Amelia, despite the teacher education input she had received. So in her classroom, students wrote a first draft, and after peer feedback, they used white out. Do you know what it is? White out? So it's a kind of correction fluid, correction pen. Or people call it write out. Do you use it here?
Liquid paper?
Yes. To make changes at the word, phrase level. You can imagine if you use white out, the revision is going to be limited. All right? Sorry. Okay. So in the peer feedback task, Amelia focused on the past tense. I would say it's more like peer editing, focusing on language. Oh, sorry. She returned the students' writing with all the verbs in the past tense underlined by her, instead of by the students. She asked students to swap their writing with their peers and check whether the verbs underlined were correct or not. Then students wrote down the total number of mistakes their peers had made. So this is how she conducted her peer feedback lesson, right, in my lesson observation. Very limited. Right? She did not really share a lot of responsibility with students. She did quite a lot in a very limited manner. It's grade 9 students actually in Hong Kong, grade 9. In another peer feedback lesson, she focused on vocabulary. Okay? And this is what she said literally. She said, refer to the vocab book, page 24 to page 25. 1, so she was giving instruction to her students. 1, circle the vocab. 2nd, highlight the outdoor activities. So highlight the vocabulary about the outdoor activities like hiking, cycling, right? One more thing, if you are very intelligent, so she was trying to be encouraging. If you are very smart, okay, so I was expecting something, okay? You can do this. I give you a point, a bonus point. Correct the spelling. To me, it was quite disappointing because, like, it was an anticlimax to me. It's not very demanding because spelling, and don't forget that in the vocab book, you know, students can read all these outdoor activities which might have been used in the peers' writing. Okay, so to me, it's not very much like peer evaluation. It's like checking out the vocab used. So Amelia, both based on the interview and lesson observation, appear to have a rather superficial understanding of peer feedback and used it in a limiting and decontextualized way. She also underestimated her students' abilities. Right? So she thought that a very, very smart student could correct the spelling. Right? Factors affecting feedback innovation, from my study, teachers' knowledge for sure, students' expectations, lack of support from colleagues, and teacher appraisal, contextual constraints. I'm going to go through this one by one very briefly. For Amelia, I think she appeared to exhibit inadequate knowledge of the concept of peer feedback and process writing. The fact that she asked her students to use white out to correct words or phrases instead of asking them to take out another piece of paper and write a fresh draft show that the understanding is a bit superficial. And if we look at students' expectations, partly this could have shaped Amelia's practice because she said, my students did not like multiple drafting, and that's why I just asked them to make changes in the initial draft using white out. Sometimes it's hard, it's like a chicken and egg issue. Is it because students don't like multiple drafting, so the teacher adopted this approach? Or is it because the teacher has adopted this approach for ages, shaping students' expectation? You know what I mean? So it's really hard to tell. Lack of support for Gwen, fear of isolation. She didn't want to appear to be different from her colleagues. Students compare, colleagues compare, we have composition inspection, and the colleagues will question why I'm marking in a different way. Like using focus marking, but why they have to spot out every mistake. Teacher appraisal, as I told you before, Gwen reverted to unfocused WCF because of composition inspection. Contextual constraints, Gwen reverted from coded to direct WCF in the second school term because of lack of time. Amelia's process approach, also lack of time. Okay, so remaining questions. It's important to invest in teachers' continuing professional development as far as feedback is concerned, to, in general, have them come to grasp with innovative feedback practices. Innovative in their own context, although these ideas may not be that new in the broader research literature. At the institutional level, support of school leaders is crucial. Teachers have to engage in communities of practice. They have to work together or collaboratively with their colleagues. And probably they have to adopt a more bottom-up approach to change in a group to empower themselves. If they just innovate in isolation, is really hard. So some of the remaining questions, even for teacher educators like myself, how can we inculcate an awareness of the importance of professional learning, learning in a professional community? Okay. And how can we involve school leaders, administrators, and apart from teachers, in the whole school approach to change? So finally, I have 7 more minutes. Where from here? Complex issue. I am not able to answer all the issues I have uncovered, but some of my conclusions are We really have to focus on developing students' writing abilities rather than just grammar and vocabulary. We have to de-emphasize. Error correction is important, but maybe in certain contexts we have to de-emphasize error correction and pay more attention to other aspects of writing. Perhaps, right? Especially for school learners, we're not talking about the real advanced learners like yourself. It is important to respond to errors more selectively, right, and choose the error feedback strategies wisely. Requiring more than one draft is useful because then students can act on and engage with teacher feedback to improve their writing. Instead of using very broad assessment criteria, which does not communicate very concrete information to students, it's useful to use task or genre-specific criteria or rubrics to assess student writing. And it's important to integrate assessment with teaching and familiarize students with these assessment criteria. Of course, involving students actively in the assessment process is important to make them play a real active role in learning and assessment. Playing down scores is very important, right? Scores in classroom writing assessment. Scores are indispensable in summative assessment. But for formative classroom writing assessment, perhaps teachers can think of ways to really de-emphasize scores a bit and let students focus on teacher feedback. Teachers have to be very sensitive to the psychologically demotivational effects of conventional feedback practices and try to help students understand their strengths and how they make use of their strengths and how they work on their weaknesses. And I think more importantly, teachers have to adopt a more critical approach, learning to really challenge their own practices, some of the taken for granted assumptions in their age-old practices, and involve colleagues in communities of practice. So, this is always important for me as a teacher educator. We have to step up teacher education. What I'm doing here as a visiting scholar in OISE, hopefully, stepping up teacher education on feedback in writing and other aspects of writing, develop common vision among members of our professional communities here, okay, how to facilitate and sustain feedback innovation. Future research. Lots of different viable areas for feedback research, like teacher education on feedback. Teachers' own research, they are, very useful members of the community. We rely on the teachers to carry out innovation, so their own action research, classroom-based research, okay, narrative inquiry, etc., will be very useful. A greater emphasis on feedback studies in real pedagogical context instead of, laboratory-like context using the experimental research design. Teachers' feedback practices, real practices in real context, how they grapple with the real constraints they face. What about students, their own role in feedback? How can they be empowered? What do they really think? How do they really react to and engage with teacher feedback? What happens during the process of reading teacher feedback, thinking about feedback? So introspective data will be useful, like think aloud protocols. Okay. The role of feedback in formative assessment, something I'm also interested in. We have been talking a lot about assessment for learning and learning. Error correction as a specific area, focusing on errors per se, is also important. Does a focused approach really work better than an unfocused approach? Okay, what WCF strategies are most conducive? Direct, error feedback, indirect, coded, uncoded, or giving metalinguistic explanation in writing or orally? So these are different WCF strategies. Okay, finally, the last thing we want to see happen in the classroom is that teachers consume their time and energy, which is happening, without making a real difference in students' writing development. And this is happening in a lot of L2, especially EFL classrooms, including Hong Kong. Okay, thank you.
Right hand up.
Yeah. 4 o'clock.
Yeah. So maybe let's have a few minutes or 10 minutes maybe to discuss or ask question or comment for. Anybody has any questions or comments? Oh, Maggie.
So I was wondering if you had looked especially at the interactions between the effectiveness of the teacher in getting their students to improve their writing and the beliefs that those teachers expressed and their practices and their reasons for doing or not doing what they did. Did you look at the effectiveness piece and see how they might be different?
Effectiveness of teacher feedback practices on student writing?
No, the effectiveness of the teachers, so the teachers who were able to help their students improve the most. Have you looked into that at all?
Yes and no, right? I think the notion of effectiveness is kind of slippery. When we think about effectiveness, what are we really thinking of? Effectiveness in terms of what? I mean, as a researcher, I would think about what is the, sorry.
Yeah, but there's definitely effective teachers. And
I know.
teachers.
So I'll step back and think about, okay, when I'm thinking about feedback, we can talk about effective feedback. What does it mean? Effective feedback means feedback having a positive outcome on student learning and student writing. So it's the student learning, the process, as well as the product, right? So, sorry.
I'm not specifically talking about feedback, I'm specifically talking about the teachers who are all round generally good at getting their students to improve, and then looking at their practices and how they differ.
Well, that is not the focus of my research, because I think for all-rounded effective teachers, again, it's really hard to say.
Because that would be a nice window, don't you think, on looking at how feedback can feed into the effective teaching.
Yeah, it's an interesting window, and it's an interesting research area. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Something for you to consider. I saw the hand.
Go ahead.
Sorry, yes.
You go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah, I think I'm going to go first. I have a question in regards of your idea of innovation,
Yeah.
especially peer feedback.
Okay.
And I have a question maybe you can answer very sort of based on your experience, because it happened to me like 15 years ago when I was an EFL teacher in my country. And I tried this innovation in my classroom with another student giving feedback of their writing. But the problem was that the other student was not as good as the other one, so they can give feedback, and it happens several times that I tried this innovation. And it didn't work because the other was complaining like, this guy is correcting me something that he doesn't know.
I have received this kind of sort of question comment many times, right? I think
So I wonder how helpful is this for the student at all, or just avoid with the peer feedback because it's not
I
working.
think as reviewed in peer feedback research findings, we have to think about coaching, first of all, how teachers prepare students for the peer feedback sessions. And then after coaching is the grouping issue, heterogeneous, homogeneous, group size, and more importantly is the peer feedback activity itself. What exactly do students have to do? I personally am more inclined towards giving students smaller tasks to begin with. Because a lot of teachers think that, oh, peer feedback, okay, swap your piece, read, comment on everything I have taught you. It may be a bit difficult for some students initially. So I would adopt this one at a time principle initially, especially if there are some weaker learners in the class. I could tell them, okay, in this story writing, maybe this time I can give you just a 20-minute or 30-minute peer feedback session, okay? Depends on the proficiency level. Just focus on, for example, the story structure. Remember, I've taught you these 1, 2, 3, 4 elements. Try to see if the peer has included this story structure in their piece. So something focused. Or even as small as try to focus on the beginning and the ending of the story. I taught you this and that. What is good beginning and good ending? Try to apply your understanding of a good beginning and good story ending to this piece. So it's manageable. I think weaker students understand what good story structure is, although they may not be able to use beautiful language. to, you know, draft a story or craft a story. Yeah. So I feel that this is a very valid and legitimate question, but it requires experience on the part of the teachers and reflectiveness on the part of the teacher to be able to carry out peer feedback effect. I would encourage teachers to really start small and then reflect and don't jump to the conclusion that, oh, it didn't work today, then peer feedback does not work. Do you see what I mean? Peer feedback can work, and that's why teachers are so important, right? Is the method itself may not work, but the teacher can make it work, I think. Yeah. Have I answered your question?
Yes, yes, yes.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Okay. Welcome.
I'd like to start with one of the statements of probably the final slide. You said that you would like to inspire classroom teachers to give a better feedback in the classroom.
My last slide?
Probably not the
this last
slide,
right?
one of the last slides, yeah.
Okay.
But that was one of the future directions
Okay.
of probably your career
To
as a
encourage
teacher.
them to innovate, to think.
Absolutely,
Yes,
and
yes.
to give better feedback, particularly talk about the classroom.
Yeah.
I was wondering, I think it reminded me of some criticisms of process writing theory in general, because some people have criticized process theory in this way that process writing theorists are still very didactic.
Mm-hmm.
They still believe that the teachers have the technique of writing, they know how people should write, and they can teach the students in the classroom how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if we shouldn't really undermine the role of the teacher as the knower of the technique of writing.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, shouldn't we kind of rethink our view of writing happening only in the traditional classroom?
Oh yeah, sure.
Aren't these two elements really, really problematic themselves? And if we remove these ideas, probably, don't you think that we might think of giving feedback in completely new forms?
Like?
Probably, just inviting real writers to join our classes and to create communities of writing, rather than writing classrooms. Not practicing writing, because our students are forever practicing writing, they never write. Or probably thinking about the genres of our students. So I would have loved to know who those students were, but which communities they came from. But when you were talking about students' voices, why were they writing? How much those teachers got? Who are those teachers? What genres are they particularly writing? So I think, for example, an attention to genre would be an alternative as well.
Yeah.
So I've been thinking about this. Can we just forget about the role of a teacher as the possessor of the technique of writing?
As the knower.
Absolutely,
As
and think about the classroom, the traditional classroom, as the only place where writing could occur.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your comment and suggestions. Very interesting. I think although I talk about process, multiple drafting, doesn't mean that other approaches cannot be used in the classroom. Actually, like my students should know that we talk about an eclectic approach. We combine different approaches. So it could be like process, but process is not the it's not the key. It's not the key to all the problems and issues. We can have a genre approach. Teacher as a knower, quite inevitably in some situations, but teacher as a learner and a co-learner, right? And sometimes we assign writing topics because we have to prepare students for public examinations and standardized assessment, but writing more interesting, more authentic pieces, like not practicing writing from the newspaper, writing on the blog, right? My students know that I'm a supporter of blogging, right? We have a class blog, so blogging can be very empowering, right? Real writing. Forget about the scores, the error feedback, but expressing your individuality, your voice. Yes, for sure. So I like our ideas. So we can combine different features.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with process writing. I'm just
Yeah.
imagining those possibilities.
Yes.
if you forget about the classroom, what happens? I think that opens up a lot of new possibilities. And I understand your point of view entirely.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that I don't want to be critical of process writing.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to imagine new forms
Yeah.
of feedback. Probably that might include, I don't know, just...
Which is good. And that's why blogging is so useful, because if you comment on another blog post, you are without being aware of it. You are doing it. You are capable of doing it. You don't even have to be taught and coached, right? So in time, if you do it like every year, every semester, students may have improved a lot and developed a stronger interest, a stronger voice, and greater confidence in writing. But poor students in the traditional classroom, oh, September writing this topic, write feedback, they are so scared. They feel so diffident. So I like this idea, but whether we can really throw out the whole thing, okay, is another. There are so many constraints, especially in exam-oriented context. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But there's a song by John Lennon, Imagine. You know the song?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
But
We need
I
to
do imagine
be
those
imaginative.
situations. But the reality is that still good writers don't come out of the classrooms. So still those writing communities exist outside. So it's not a sheer imagination.
This is a quote. My quote here: "Good writers don't come out of the classroom."
Or the traditional.
Yeah.
If you're writing it down, act traditional. So they don't come out of the traditional classroom.
Yeah.
But those writing, it's not sheer imagination. Those writing communities exist in the world.
Yeah,
That's
I
what
like the
I'm
idea of
saying.
writing
I'm
communities.
sorry.
I think writing communities are very important. I mean, professional learning communities, writing communities, right? Just different sorts of productive. Wow. Yeah. Can we go on? Sorry. Yeah. I really enjoy this sort of discussion exchange. Yeah.
Hi, Icy. Thank
Yeah, hi.
you for the really comprehensive presentation. A couple of initiatives that I've seen at work help, I think, to answer one of your big questions, and that's sort of how do we deal with all of these constraints. And I don't necessarily feel equally excited about both, but I thought it would be interesting to just share with you. In a university writing setting at a university somewhere in Canada that will remain unnamed.
Okay.
Because
Anonymous.
it's part, right, anonymous. No, it's part of somebody's project. They have adopted a sheet that has all these error codes on it, and if you think that the Hong Kong teachers are feeling stressed out, imagine a situation where from writing assignment to writing assignment, the teacher is responsible for completing a tracking sheet and counting the number of
It's like an error
errors.
log.
An error log.
Yeah.
And the promise sold by this institution is that take one of our courses and over the semester you will decrease the number of errors in these categories. So what's been interesting is to observe what happens with teachers. So yes, they're exhausted, but they do this. They've figured out that they really need to involve students, that it's not enough to just say, from week to week you went from this many of errors. So what they've done is they have incentivized the final exam. So they can take in one tool into the final exam, and that is a sheet where they have a typical error that they've made in one of these categories, and a correction. So it's usually sentence-based.
Okay.
And they have a correction that the teacher has overseen the production of. So they can take that in to use for their final writing task that they, has a big percentage. And they've found that it's that part where the student actually has to think and realize, wow, I've repeated this same kind of error 79 times over all this writing. So it's something that I'm not all that excited about, and that is, from the teacher point of view, incredibly tedious, but they've found a way to actually make it work. So that's one thing. At ILA last year, I was really interested in learning more about feedback. and went to several sessions where writing centers and writing center directors had adopted oral feedback software. And it was really interesting to hear what direction teachers go in when they're using these software that allows you to speak and identify an error. So without necessarily correcting it, you're speaking to it. So these writing centers more and more don't have the capacity to have a one-on-one with the student, but do this type of oral feedback. And I guess one of the final things is, how come not more technology is used, and why aren't Hong Kong teachers allowing their students to word process? And
oh, this is a good question. These ideas are absolutely wonderful. Using software, could be oral, could be software like Grammarly, right? But A is whether Grammarly suits school learners, you know? Why not word process? Because in the public examination, no word processing is allowed. So because teachers are so keen on giving students plenty of examination practice and preparation for examinations. So imagine if students do word processing for their ongoing compositions, when it comes to the final, the public exam, they cannot write. They cannot write fast. This is one problem.
wow.
Yeah.
And how do you deal knowing that about 60% only of the errors are actually corrected accurately?
Okay.
So you know, you sort of went through that slide like
Yeah.
every other slide, but it kind of struck me that that is a really big percentage of errors.
Yeah. But don't generalize and think that in Hong Kong the teachers are no good.
No, I'm not saying they're no good.
No. I have to, give you this caveat. The sample is about 60 teachers. Okay, 60 teachers. And don't ask me about the detailed qualifications, I cannot remember. But I think many of the teachers are not very experienced teachers. But still, there are so many new teachers in the classroom. If they cannot correct errors accurately.
However, I guess when I saw it at first, I went, oh! And then I thought of my own writing teaching practices where when I have something that's so overwhelmingly problematic that I decide, okay, I can only deal with this little portion. So I sometimes leave some horrific things around, and because I only do perhaps a direct correction of a portion of it, it actually would look, if you were looking at it, trying to figure out if my correction was appropriate, it would be inappropriate. It would be considered incorrect. And I think we've all faced these kinds of writing tasks that students submit to us.
I think the examples were different. Would you consider it kind of incorrect? I think the examples she gave were what they had done, the feedback they had.
Right, but it made me imagine, like the one with many.
And other things, so many other things.
That's right. It was like she corrected a part of it, but not all of it. And as a result, it then looked incorrect. And I know many teachers just get to that feeling of being overwhelmed. And they don't know if they are doing selective correction. Okay, by selectively correcting, yes, the research says that focusing on fewer things is great, but if you are focusing only on fewer things and sometimes you're not dealing with a bigger structural piece, it still remains problematic.
But you need a policy. Like
no, absolutely. And in fact, that was the last thing that I was going to say. The only successful changes that I've seen have been when the entire school or school district and community is involved, and it becomes something that you have to do.
A standard practice.
A standard practice. You can't keep your job. You will be evaluated on that. And until that happens, teachers are going to feel guilted into correcting every error.
Yes.
In my opinion.
So my next phase of research, if I get the grant, I'm going to do it like in the whole school. Or at least to convince the principal that for the moment, don't appraise the teacher based on the amount of feedback. That has to be waived. Because the research project is going on, you cannot appraise that teacher and penalize the teacher for a smaller amount of reading error correction. Yeah. So it's very complex. The whole thing is very complex. And therefore, you notice that more and more people are interested in doing feedback research because it's so interesting, so intriguing, so intricate, and yet so important. Right? Yeah.
Yeah. Any other question? Otherwise, yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.